Today I want to talk just a little bit about e-collar conditioning, right? And layer it in with stuff we've already talked about on operant conditioning and classical conditioning, and then a direct application to place command, right? So some of the things that I want to talk about, some of you already done a little bit, but basically how do you start the conditioning process around the place, right? That's one way that we could do e-collar conditioning. Introductions, and we do a lot of that with our police dogs that way. But first I want to talk a little bit about e-collars in general, right? So basically there's two ways for us to use an e-collar, right? We can use an e-collar as an aversive or punishment, right? So, you know, think of a leash and collar correction from a prong collar, right? That's positive punishment, right? If the dog understands a command, and we've already put in or installed that behavior through some sort of reinforcement process. Then if the dog doesn't do what we want it to do, there's a cost to not doing what we want it to do. We give the dog a correction, right? So it could be through a leash and collar. What if we wanted to replace that leash and collar correction with a different type of correction, one coming through an e-collar? Right, so we could go through a process that we call pairing, which is a associative learning process or a classical conditioning process, and simply associate the new correction with the old correction, right? So if, let's say we're healing with the dog, and the dog floats out ahead a little bit, right? And I make a turn, give it a little correction on my prong collar, right? The dog understands that like 180-degree correction for healing with the prong collar. How would I then layer in the e-collar correction with that? So I would heel with my dog, and I would put the new correction, which would be the tap on the e-collar, right, in front of the old correction the dog already knows, which is the leash and collar correction. So as I start healing, if the dog floats ahead of me, it would be, we call it nick and then pop, right? So nick with the e-collar, pop with the line, right? The dog comes into place and into a heel again. The dog understands what it is that we want in that case. How do we know the e-collar correction starts to take hold and the dog understands it?
You don't need to pop.
Yeah, quickly the dog will start reacting to the e-collar correction, right, and coming into position. So it'll beat that second correction fairly quickly, right? And then you can start to see, okay, in that context, the dog understands what the correction for healing might be, right? Same thing if we're healing and the dog goes wide, we make a right turn, nick, pop, dog comes into position. After a while, if I make a right turn and the dog floats wide, on the nick, we should start to see the dog come into position, right? So you can, like, in a very sort of quick and dirty way, teach e-collar corrections for various behaviors, like super fast. And the dogs will pick up on them. Like a lot of times when I do my police dog seminars, those dogs are very used to leash and collar corrections, and I'll just have them like walk in a square, right? And I'll put a little bit of distractions out, and we'll work on forging and floating wide. And I will actually stand in the middle of the box and I'll hold the e-collar remote, and then all I have to do is, as they make their turn, if the dog gets forged or gets wide, I have to be faster than them on my button to make sure I can put the nick in before they actually give the correction. So I say, you guys just concentrate on giving your leash and collar corrections to the dog. I'll make sure I get the e-collar correction in ahead of you, right? And so usually when you do that, like, you know, a minute and the dog is already reacting to the e-collar corrections and they understand what it is in that context, right? So it doesn't mean because the dog reacts to the e-collar correction in a singular context that they really understand, you know, how that correction works in all manner of contexts, right? So, you know, we are making an association in one context. It has to be what? Generalized, right? Remember when we talked about in obedience theory, we talked about going from acquisition through fluency to generalization, right? Like that's our big picture process when we're doing obedience training, right? So we're going through that process. Well, this would be fluency initially, right? Getting fluent with the correction, and it's just replacing the old correction with a new correction, and then finally generalizing that new correction into all manner of circumstances, right? So the dog understands it. So pairing is a way that we can introduce the e-collar more as an aversive, okay? Where would that fall in terms of operant conditioning matrix? Positive punishment, right? Because we're using it as a correction, right? And here in positive punishment, what are we doing? We're adding in, right, an unpleasant consequence to decrease the likelihood of the behavior, right? So if we're talking about forging, getting wide, those are behaviors that we don't want during healing, right? And we'll be punishing those behaviors. When the dog stays in good heel position, what do? Positive reinforcement, right? We want to give it a little bit of food or a toy. So we want to differentially reinforce, right? So when we're reinforcing the good behavior of healing properly, so if I'm walking in a box and I make a turn, the dog stays nice and tight to me, boom, I'll pop out my tuck, give the dog a reward, start over again. Maybe I have to like change the context a little bit, increase the level of distraction a little bit, like to pull the dog out of position some in order to be able to deliver that aversive correction and have the dog learn it in that context, right? But once the dog starts doing it well, we want to positively reinforce the behavior we want to see, right? All right, so what's another way for us to condition behaviors, right? Well, we can use the e-collar as punishment, but we can also use it to reinforce, right? How do we use an e-collar to reinforce behavior? Negative reinforcement, right? So if we go back and look at our definition of negative reinforcement, what is that? That's installing a behavior by what means? Right, and removing an undesirable consequence in order to increase the likelihood of a behavior. So, right, let's say the dog doesn't know how to heel whatsoever, right? Just as an example, not necessarily saying this is a really good idea. But let's say the dog has no idea about heeling. And so I start with the dog right next to me, and I start walking, right? And as I start walking, I start tapping on the collar, right? And the dog forges wide, and I make a little turn. The dog comes back into heel position next to me, and I take the collar off. And then we keep walking, and it floats a little wide, right? As soon as I start to see the dog float a little bit wide, I start tapping on the collar. Negative, right? A negative aversive event, but it's low level, right? It's more of an annoyance because I'm trying to signal to the dog when you're out of position, you're going to feel a little bit of this stim. When you come back into position, though, what happens? Stim comes off, right? So I could use that as a means to install that healing behavior with the dog. Now, I don't necessarily do that because I think there are too many things for the dog to explore in healing, right? To start with that right out of the gate. And we're probably going to have to apply way too much stim in order for the dog to understand it. I've seen people do this with dogs in that way before. And, you know, the old saying, right? Sausage tastes really good, but nobody really wants to see it being made, right? Like that's that kind of training, right? It can be, the dog can show a lot of confusion, right? Doing things where the dog doesn't understand any sort of boundary because they haven't done any leash training, right? And so the dog is just trying to figure out where does the stimulation stop, right? We can make that so much more clear to the dog by first doing some, at least luring and putting the dog on reward and heel position a little bit, right? Then we can, you know, explore using the e-collar to create some boundaries with negative reinforcement. But here's what I want you to think about. When we're using negative reinforcement to teach behaviors, there's two kinds of things that we have to look at. We have to look at how to push a dog with pressure or stimulation and how to pull a dog with pressure or stimulation. Did Ben and Ann talk about any of this stuff in their lecture a little bit? No? Okay. All right. What's that? You can, okay. All right. So pushing and pulling, what does that mean? So let's say I'm working on recalls and healing, right? In general with the dog. It doesn't matter if we're doing negative reinforcement or positive punishment. But basically, in general, when a dog is away from me, right, and I recall him, right? Where does all the reward, what's the reinforcement history of that particular behavior going to be? At me, right? If the dog stays in heel position, where is the reinforcement history of that behavior going to be? At me. Positive reinforcement at me. So what's it going to do is it's going to naturally draw the dog to the handler. Now, if you do only this type of work with your dog, what might you struggle with? It might become like kind of a default, like a little safety-seeking behavior, because the dog knows whenever I'm here, that's safe. Heel position, next to the handler, coming back, safe place, right? So, but it kind of defaults the dog to coming to you, right? So how can we balance that out? Now, if, like, let's say you're training pet dogs, all right? What's the one thing that pet owners want? Yeah, like not going away, not chasing them around the neighborhood, right? Like if you create a dog, a pet dog that is defaulted to running back to you all the time, checking in with you, like you go on a walk and you give the dog some freedom and it goes, 10 or 15 feet out and then it's like, where are you at? And then it comes back to you and then you give him a little positive reinforcement, you're like, okay. You're like, go do your thing, be a dog, right? He walks around, he starts sniffing a little bit, right? And he starts ranging a little bit away from you. And then he's like, feeling like I'm a little far from mom or dad, right? And then boom, he checks in with you, he comes back. Pet dog people will love that, right? If you're doing a building search with a police dog and you want him to go forward and hunt independently of you, and he goes 3 steps, checks back in with you, and he's like, are you coming? And you're like, okay, you didn't get the memo. No, I'm not coming. Okay, I'm staying back here where it's safe, you go, right? We don't send him that memo, right? But that's kind of what we're doing, right? So we don't want that dog necessarily to be defaulted to like always checking in, being around us. However, I have seen police dogs where they've done way too much obedience with the dog, right? Where that dog doesn't want to range away from the handler, right? That's why when we're doing police dogs, what are we always doing? Lots of positive reinforcement out away from the handler. Building searches, area searches. That's why we're always telling you guys, stay at the cover position. Don't follow the dog all the time. Don't, we have to a little bit to help them in the beginning, but then we got to back off and let the dog be independent, right? Because most of what they're going to be doing, tracking, they got to be out ahead of you. Building search, they got to be out ahead of you. Area search, they got to be out ahead of you. I don't want them looking back at me. I want them concerned with their environment, right? And hunting and being independent. So what's a way in which we can use the e-collar to kind of balance out in our conditioning process the default of pull, right? That comes from recalls and comes from healing, right? With push, which is, can I tell my dog, go away from me, and you have to go away from me, right? That's where the place command comes in, right? So when we do the place command, basically we can condition the e-collar without creating too much default to heel position and to coming back to the handler. And in fact, if you want to have a really independent dog, you can train the e-collar, do the e-collar conditioning off the place command rather than doing it, which most people do, off the healing and off the recalls, right? So we can have something where we can balance our dog out. So I can push my dog away from me and teach him that when you go away from me and get on this place command, the stimulation is going to stop. So I would do it with some negative reinforcement, right? In order to condition the e-collar in this context. Does that make sense? So everybody understand what I mean by pushing the dog with stim, right? And pulling a dog with stim. Now when we're doing negative reinforcement, what's the goal is apply some unpleasant stimulus to the dog, but not so much unpleasant stimulus that it clouds the dog's mind. So it has to be really kind of low level. Remember, when we're doing this, by definition, for it to be negative reinforcement, it has to be stimulation the dog wants to turn off, right? This is why, like, when people ask me, well, can I just use the vibration? No, vibration isn't something the dog gives a shit about. It could be on, it could be off, it doesn't really matter. Now, sometimes if you have a little sensitive dog, right? You can use stimulation, it'll startle them for a quick second, right? But if you keep doing that, what are we going to run into? We talked about it in the obedience lecture. Habituation, right? After a while, you're going to be like, this is neither negative nor positive. It doesn't affect me in any way, right? So I don't have to pay attention to it, right? So you can quickly lose the effect of vibration. And we did talk about in the obedience lecture, how could we use vibration in different contexts? We can use it as a cue. Because then, right, if let's say I'm doing a building search and I want to cue the dog without saying anything, right, to come back to me, I could condition the dog to recall upon feeling the vibration, right? But that would involve vibration, right? Recall the dog, positive reinforcement, right? And then the dog would be like, when I feel this vibration, if I run back to the handler, good things happen, right? So we could just have a silent recall on the dog through the vibration. So it can be used as a cue, but it's only good as a cue if it's associated with something, right? And in this case, we would associate it with something positive in order to drive the dog to want to come back to us. All right, but I don't want to get too far afield on that. So when we're using negative reinforcement, we have to use the electricity, right, that the collar is producing. And I want to talk about that for one quick second, right? When we're doing e-collars, right, there are different brands of e-collars. Why? A lot of them have different qualities of sensation, right? Some of them are hotter than others, which means there's more amperage in them. They push out more power, right? So a 2 on a 500 Pro Garmin is not necessarily a 2 on an Educator, right? Not only power-wise, right, but also quality-wise in terms of the stimulation. So when we're talking about electricity, amperage is the power that it puts out, okay? If you think of water flowing through a hose, right? Bigger amperage, bigger hose, more volume of water goes through per second, okay? The pet collars tend to be not quite so hot as some of the working dog collars because it doesn't take as much to get a pet dog's attention as it does to take a working dog's attention, right? So amperage is something that you have to look at, and also what quality of power wave comes off the e-collar. So for example, Garmin's and Dogtra's tend to have what we call a sharp power wave. So if you hooked it up to an oscilloscope, which takes electrical input and shows you what it looks like in waveform, right? Most electricity is coming in pulses, right? So what you'll see with this e-collar, if you get like a Garmin or a Dogtra, is you'll see the power wave is going to look like that, which means the power comes out, rises quickly, peaks, and falls off really quickly. And then it does it again. It's like a sawtooth. Right? And when you hold down the continuous button on an e-collar, right, if you ever put your hand on it and feel it, it goes like little needles going, right, like a sewing machine. It's not like this one continuous stream of electricity, okay? So that's a power wave from sharp stem. From the e-collar technologies, you tend to get what we call, what they call blunt stimulation, right? And so it looks a little bit more like a power wave coming off like a TENS unit if you were to put something like that on your body, right? So it's a little flatter, right? What's the difference? What's important about this? Well, let's say you have a dog that reacts a little negatively to stimulation, right? Maybe a dog that's a little handler aggressive, right? Or a dog that's a little unclear sometimes when it gets stimmed, right? If you're using this type of e-collar, that may be part of why, because it really ramps up the dog's reaction kind of fairly quickly. Whereas this one is a little duller, a little blunter, right? And so there's not so much to react to. So when I first started training Raptor, I had him on a Garmin, right? Because I had a collar that worked 2 different receiver units. I had one for Drago and I had one for Raptor. And I got a lot more handler aggression out of Raptor in the beginning when I would even use lower levels of stim with him. He reacted to it kind of aversely, right? So He would sometimes come up the line, he would sometimes, like tag him in the leg when he would get the stim. Then I went to Ecollar Technologies with him, this type of power wave, and it calmed a lot of that overreaction to the e-collar down, right? I was still able to use it, right, both as a teaching tool and as, for negative reinforcement, and I was able to use it as an aversive at higher levels, right, but he didn't react as negatively to it. So it was a good transition for me. And this is something for police dogs. Departments always, if they have like 20 dogs on the unit, order the same fucking collar for every dog, and not every dog needs the same collar, right? So a lot of times what ends up happening is everybody's on, even the handler aggressive dogs are on these hotter, sharper stem collars, and it's not always necessarily a good thing for that particular dog. Something to keep in mind, right? And when people come to school and they're like, what kind of, I got this competition dog, he's kind of high drive, what kind of e-collar should I use for him? And I say, test a couple out, see what the reactions look like, and see how the dog does with each, because they're a little different, okay? All right, so that's pushing, that's pulling, talked about power waves, blunt stimulation, sharp stimulation,